Another article that I'm really excited about and thinking about is expanding queer architectural theory towards a framework of decolonial queer borderlands architecture. This is an article by Lucas Baylory from the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona, USA. So the abstract reads like this, and then I'm going to talk through the article. Abstract. Queer theorists have interrogated heteropatriarchy in architecture and urbanism by examining masculinist organizations of space. Yet these critiques are epistemologically bound by geographic, racial, class, and gendered power structures. I summarize scholarship on queer architecture and describe how queer theorists of architecture can and should expand scholarship beyond existing confines. Considering the distinctive queer architectures of the borderland, I examine how intersectional marginalizations and subversions shape queer borderland life and produce novel spatial formations. This paper considers the capacious possibility of a decolonial queer borderland theory of architecture to understand important yet understudied organizations of space. So it's a great article. If you can get a hold of the Sage publication, go for it. Yeah, I wrote something up about it. Here we go. Queer theory has often asked difficult questions about identity, power, and social norms. But what happens when queer theory turns towards architecture? What makes a space queer? Is queer architecture simply architecture designed by LGBTQ people, or does queerness transform how we understand space itself? This essay explores a recent paper by Lucas Baylory titled Expanding Queer Architectural Theory towards a framework of decolonial queer borderlands architecture. Sage Publications. I think it's 2025. The paper argues that queer architectural theory has historically focused too narrowly on wealthy, urban Western experiences, such as gay neighborhoods, nightclubs, designer homes, commercial queer spaces. These spaces matter, but Bellery argues that they represent only a small portion of queer life. Many queer experiences remain marginalized, even within queer theory itself. Rural queers, borderland communities, queer people of color, trans and gender nonconforming people, poor and precarious communities, ephemeral spaces, temporary gatherings, improvised architectures of survival. The paper asks us to rethink architecture not only as buildings, but as relationships between bodies, movement, power, visibility, and survival. One of the paper's central concepts is homonormativity. This refers to forms of queer politics that become aligned with mainstream systems of power, consumerism, respectability, domesticity, assimilation. Instead of challenging dominant structures, homonormativity often reproduces them. This appears spatially through upscale gay neighborhoods, luxury development, gentrification, and highly commercialized queer districts. The paper argues that queer architectural theory has often focused on precisely these spaces. As a result, queer theory sometimes reproduces racial and economic exclusions rather than dismantling them. Valerie wants to move beyond this limitation. The essay traces several recurring themes within queer architectural theory. One is the blurring of public and private space. Queer spaces have historically complicated traditional boundaries between intimacy and visibility, bars, clubs, cruising grounds, shared domestic spaces. These spaces often allowed private acts to become semi-public. Architecture facilitated this ambiguity. Mirrors, dark corridors, runway-like interiors, layered rooms, concealed entrances. Queer architecture often enabled forms of visibility and secrecy simultaneously. Another major theme is spectacle. Queer spaces frequently relied upon performance, theatricality, ornamentation, and visual signaling. Architecture became expressive, decor became communicative, buildings themselves could perform queerness. But spectacle also carried risks. Visibility could invite surveillance, regulation, and violence. Queer architecture therefore constantly negotiated between exposure and concealment. A third theme involves desire. The paper discusses how architecture facilitated social and sexual interaction. Certain spatial arrangements encouraged looking, movement, and encounter. The organization of bodies within space became politically significant. This is especially visible in discussions of nightclubs and cruising spaces. Design shaped behavior. Architecture shaped relationships. The paper even extends this analysis into digital space. Apps like Grindr become forms of architecture. Digital platforms reorganize proximity, visibility, and urban interaction. The city itself changes through digital desire. But Baylory's most important intervention may be his discussion of ephemerality and borderlands. Many queer spaces are temporary. They appear and disappear. A rented room, a dance night, an improvised gathering, a shelter, a temporary protest site, a pop-up event. These spaces often leave little material trace. And because architecture has traditionally focused on permanence, these forms of queer spatial life become difficult to archive. The paper argues that this ephemerality is not a weakness, it is central to queer survival. Marginalized communities frequently create space under conditions of instability. Queer architecture may therefore exist not as monumental buildings, but as fleeting social infrastructures. The paper then moves towards its central idea, decolonial queer borderlands architecture. This concept draws heavily from Gloria Anzaldua's theory on borderlands. Borderlands are not simply geographical borders, they are spaces of overlapping identities, exclusions, contradictions, and hybrid existence. Queer borderlands architecture emerges from these conditions. It reflects survival under systems of colonial racism, poverty, and heteronormativity. Importantly, Baylory argues that borderland architecture cannot be understood only through formal design. It also exists through improvisation, reuse, adaptation, emotional geography, community care, shared vulnerability. One of the most fascinating concepts the paper discusses is Rasquachismo, a Chicano, excuse me, I'm sure I mispronounced it, a Chicano aesthetic tradition associated with survival, improvisation, and working class creativity. Rasquache aesthetics emerge from scarcity. Things held together with spit, grit, and movidas, as the paper describes. This framework transforms how we think about architecture. Improvised space becomes meaningful. Temporary structures become politically important. Marginalized aesthetics become forms of resistance. The paper connects Rasquache aesthetics to queer Latinx spaces in cities like Los Angeles, San Antonio, and Tucson. These are not polished commercial queer districts. They are messy, improvised, layered, emotional, sometimes unstable, but they create belonging. The paper repeatedly insists that architecture cannot be separated from systems of power. Colonialism shapes space, race shapes space, gender shapes space, class shapes space, borders shape space. Architecture is never neutral. This becomes especially visible in the discussion of healthcare spaces and trans embodiment. The paper draws on theorists like Paul Preciado, who argues that architecture itself operates as a political technology. Buildings organize bodies, institutions organize movement, architecture produces norms, and therefore, architecture can also be resisted. Queer and trans architecture becomes practices of disobedience, a refusal of fixed categories, a refusal of rigid binaries. The essay closes by arguing for a broader, more decolonial approach to queer architectural theory. Not architecture centered only on wealthy urban queer subjects, but architecture attentive to migration, precarity, racialization, environmental vulnerability, and survival. This shift matters because it changes what counts as architecture. A shelter can matter, a temporary gathering can matter, an improvised borderland home can matter. A care network can matter, a protest space can matter. Architecture expands beyond monumental buildings. It becomes relational, embodied, political, and perhaps most importantly, the paper asks us to understand marginalized spaces not only through lack or exclusion, but through a creativity, improvisation, persistence, and collective survival. Queer borderlands architecture therefore becomes more than a theory of design. It becomes a way of understanding how people create livable worlds under systems that attempt to constrain them.